The sea that night was black and endless. A moonless sky hung low over the dark waters off Honshu, where the Imperial Japanese Navy's newest warship moved silently toward the strait. Her name was Shinano, and she was unlike anything the world had ever seen. From the deck, she seemed eternal. A floating fortress stretching nearly 900 feet, built upon the bones of a battleship. Her hull, once intended for a sister to the Yamato, had been reborn into a secret weapon, an armored aircraft carrier so vast that sailors whispered it could turn the tide of the war. But beneath the hum of her engines and the steady roll of the waves, there was unease. The crew had been assembled in haste. The ship's fittings were unfinished. Her watertight doors still untested. And yet, she was ordered to sail, without escort, without full readiness, and without knowing that somewhere in the darkness, an American submarine was already waiting. The Shinano's massive bulk cut through the Pacific, her wake glowing faintly in the night. Inside the control tower, officers spoke in low voices, the air thick with cigarette smoke. Captain Toshio Abe stood at the bridge window, his hand resting on a chart illuminated by a dim red light. His orders were simple: reach Kure Naval Base by dawn, avoid detection, and prepare for war. But war was already coming for him. Hours later, just after midnight, four white streaks would race through the black water, and the largest warship ever built would never see another sunrise. To understand the tragedy of the Shinano, you must go back, before the night she sank, before the secret orders that launched her, to a time when Japan's empire still believed it could win. In the early months of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood at its height. The attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Carrier task forces swept across the seas, striking at the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The rising sun flew over every island chain. Japan's carrier force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, was the most powerful the world had ever seen. But that illusion would not last long. In June 1942, at a lonely patch of ocean called Midway, 4 of those carriers were lost in a single day. Hundreds of aircraft burned, thousands of crewmen vanished beneath the waves, and Japan's naval air power was shattered beyond repair. The defeat at Midway was more than a tactical loss, it was a psychological wound. It marked the moment when the empire's dreams of dominance began to crumble. The Navy's leadership, stunned and desperate, searched for a miracle that could restore balance. One idea began to surface in secret meetings at Kure and Yokosuka. They had no time to build new carriers from scratch. But in a dry dock at Yokosuka lay the unfinished hull of a massive battleship, hull number 110, originally intended to be the third vessel of the Yamato-class, sister to the Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever constructed. If they could not outnumber the Americans, perhaps they could outbuild them. That was how Shinano was born, not from ambition, but from desperation. Construction was shrouded in secrecy. Few outside the highest circles even knew she existed. Her name was not listed on any public registry. Work crews were ordered to silence under threat of death. The project became a ghost ship, a colossal shape rising in secret behind covered scaffolding. From the beginning, the conversion was a compromise. The Navy needed a supercarrier capable of withstanding the punishment that had destroyed its fleet at Midway. So the engineers built her around armor, thick plates of steel, reinforced decks, and a double hull meant to survive torpedoes and bombs. Yet even as they built her for endurance, they cut corners for speed. By late 1944, American bombers were already striking the Japanese homeland. The U.S. Navy's submarine blockade was choking supplies. Every delay risked destruction. So the builders worked under constant pressure, welding by torchlight through the night as air raid sirens wailed in the distance. The result was a paradox, a ship both magnificent and flawed. At 72,000 tons, she was the largest aircraft carrier ever created, dwarfing anything in existence. Her decks could carry nearly 50 aircraft, her armor thicker than any ship afloat. But beneath the steel and secrecy lay unfinished systems, faulty pumps, incomplete watertight compartments, and untested safety mechanisms. She was powerful on paper, but fragile in reality. When engineers raised concerns that more sea trials were needed, the order came down from above: launch her anyway. Japan could no longer afford perfection. On November 11, 1944, the Shinano slipped into the water. Her hull shimmered under the floodlights as workers cheered. She was the last great ship of the Imperial Navy, a final symbol of power for an empire already dying. Inside her engine rooms, the turbines roared to life. The crew trained hastily, barely familiar with the vessel's systems. Captain Abe himself had never commanded an aircraft carrier before. But his mission was urgent, to deliver vital supplies and aircraft parts to the fleet anchorage at Kure. The Shinano departed Yokosuka under a veil of darkness, her departure classified as top secret. Only a handful of people even knew she had left port. She carried 2,400 men, sailors, engineers, and trainees, and the weight of Japan's last hopes. What none of them knew was that just beyond the horizon, lurking beneath the waves, was the USS Archerfish, commanded by Commander Joseph F. Enright. The two ships were on a collision course that history would remember as one of the most improbable and devastating encounters of the entire Pacific War. The sea was calm. The moon remained hidden. The largest warship ever built was sailing straight toward her end. The men aboard Shinano carried a strange sense of pride and fear. They knew they were part of something extraordinary, yet forbidden to speak of it. Their ship was Japan's last miracle, a secret weapon that even many admirals hadn't seen. Every rivet, every weld, every glint of armor represented years of lost hope condensed into one colossal gamble. The crew called her the Steel Island. To walk her decks was to feel the weight of empire beneath your boots. Her armored flight deck stretched longer than 3 football fields, her hangars vast enough to swallow entire squadrons. The corridors echoed with the clatter of boots and shouted orders. But the closer they came to the open sea, the more the flaws revealed themselves. Doors didn't seal properly. Pumps groaned under pressure. Bulkheads leaked. In some sections, pipes were still being welded as the ship moved. A faint smell of paint and oil mixed with the salt air. The Shinano was not ready for war, she wasn't even ready for the ocean. Captain Toshio Abe felt it too. A veteran of the destroyer Ayanami, he had seen combat and believed in discipline, in duty, in the unspoken code of the Imperial Navy. But even he knew the truth, the Shinano's readiness had been rushed. Still, he could not refuse orders. His instructions were clear: sail from Yokosuka to Kure, deliver supplies for the defense of the homeland, and avoid all detection. Under no circumstances, the written orders warned, is this ship to fall into enemy hands. It was not just a ship. It was a symbol. If she reached Kure, she could serve as a floating fortress, a mobile base for the final defense of Japan's shores. But if she was lost, morale, already crumbling, would shatter completely. So the Shinano steamed southward through the night, her engines throbbing deep within the hull. Above deck, young sailors leaned over the rails, staring into the endless darkness. The air was cold. The horizon invisible. Somewhere out there, American submarines prowled like wolves. At 8 p.m. on November 28, 1944, the USS Archerfish surfaced for air about 160 miles south of Tokyo Bay. Commander Joseph F. Enright stood on the conning tower, scanning the horizon through his binoculars. He had been waiting for a chance like this for years. Enright had once been passed over for a kill, a failure that haunted him through the war. Now, with the Archerfish prowling enemy waters, he was determined not to miss another opportunity. His crew was weary after weeks of patrol, their torpedoes still loaded, their patience running thin. Then, just before midnight, radar picked up a faint contact. A large one. Through the periscope, Enright saw the silhouette of a ship, huge, towering, unlike anything he had ever seen. It was moving fast, heading southwest. At first, he thought it might be a tanker or transport. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw the shape of a flat deck, an island superstructure, and an armored bow cutting through the waves. He whispered, "That's no tanker." The Shinano had been spotted. For the next 4 hours, the Archerfish shadowed her from the darkness. The submarine ran parallel, staying just out of sight. Each time the carrier altered course, Enright matched her. The sea was calm, the sky starless. It was a deadly game of patience, a duel between a titan and a hunter the size of one of her lifeboats. Inside the submarine, the air was tense. Men moved silently, every sound amplified in the confined space. The sonar operator's headphones crackled with the faint hum of propellers, slow, steady, powerful. "Range closing," he whispered. By 3 a.m., the two vessels were less than 2,000 yards apart. Aboard the Shinano, no one knew they were being stalked. The lookouts had grown complacent, trusting their ship's speed and armor to protect them. The escort destroyers that were supposed to accompany her had turned back earlier due to fuel limitations, leaving the supercarrier alone in the dark. In the control room, Captain Abe ordered a slight turn to starboard. It was a mistake. The maneuver exposed the Shinano's broadside directly to the Archerfish. Enright seized the moment. "Stand by, all tubes forward." The torpedo room came alive with quiet precision. The crew whispered final checks, sweat beading on their foreheads. Enright looked through the periscope one last time. The massive hull filled his lens, 72,000 tons of steel gliding effortlessly across the sea. Fire 1. A hiss. Fire 2. Another hiss. Fire 3, Fire 4. For silver streaks shot through the darkness, their wakes glowing faintly in the water. Aboard Shinano, a few sailors on deck noticed the disturbance, faint lines racing toward the ship's flank. They shouted warnings, but it was too late. At 3:17 a.m., the first torpedo struck. A muffled explosion rocked the carrier. Seconds later, a second blast. Then a third. The fourth struck deeper, near the engine compartment. The ship shuddered violently. Lights flickered. Men were thrown off their feet. Steam burst from ruptured pipes as alarms screamed through the corridors. Captain Abe's voice thundered over the intercom, "Damage control. Seal all compartments." But the watertight doors, the ones never properly tested, failed to close. Water rushed through the lower decks, flooding compartments faster than the pumps could handle. Within minutes, the carrier began to list to starboard. The Archerfish dove deep, listening to the chaos above. Through the hydrophones, the crew heard the sounds of panic, explosions, bulkheads collapsing, the deep groan of twisting metal. Enright didn't celebrate. He simply wrote in his log, "Fired 4 torpedoes, 4 hits. Target very large. Possibly new carrier." Above him, the ocean boiled with bubbles and debris. But Shinano did not sink, not yet. She fought for hours. The crew battled the flooding with pumps and buckets, sealing bulkheads, trying desperately to keep the ship upright. By dawn, she was limping forward at reduced speed. The sun rose over a dying giant. Captain Abe stood on the bridge, soaked in sweat, his uniform dark with seawater. He refused to abandon ship. "We will reach Kure," he said, though he knew they would not. The flooding reached the engine rooms. Power flickered and died. At 10 a.m., the Shinano began to roll heavily. Men scrambled for the rails, shouting prayers to the Emperor. The great ship that had been built in secrecy, the pride of Japan, was now turning on her side. At 10:57 a.m., she capsized completely. The hull rose into the air, massive and silent, before slipping beneath the waves. She took more than 1,400 men with her. Only 1,080 survived. The sea above Shinano was calm again. Within minutes of her vanishing, only a few scattered planks, oil slicks, and faint cries marked where the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy had gone down. The wind carried the smell of fuel and smoke, a ghostly trace of what had been the world's largest aircraft carrier. Hours later, survivors floated in the freezing waters of the Philippine Sea, clinging to debris. Some sang softly to keep awake, others called out the names of their shipmates, their voices fading one by one. From the east, Japanese destroyers finally appeared on the horizon, alerted too late. They found hundreds of men drifting in silence, too weak to speak. When word reached Yokosuka, the news struck like thunder. The Navy's last secret weapon, lost on her maiden voyage, not to an air attack or a surface fleet, but to a single American submarine. The shame was unbearable. Inside the Naval Ministry, the disaster was buried under layers of secrecy. Official reports were classified. The name Shinano was erased from dispatches. Engineers were ordered to destroy blueprints and documents that revealed how unready the ship had truly been. But whispers spread. Those who had worked on her knew why she had died so quickly. The armor that was meant to make her invincible had also made her impossible to save. Her massive bulkheads were incomplete. Her internal pumps and watertight doors had never been properly tested. The lower compartments still had wooden scaffolding in place. When the torpedoes hit, water spread unchecked through spaces that should have been sealed. The Shinano had the heart of a giant, but the skeleton of a rushed experiment. In the aftermath, surviving officers told investigators that the ship could have been saved if she had proper escort destroyers, if the pumps had been stronger, or if Captain Abe had ordered an immediate counterflooding operation. But such decisions required experience and time. Abe had neither. The ship had left the dockyard with only half its crew trained in damage control. The Imperial Navy had gambled on a miracle, hoping to build strength faster than it could be destroyed. It had turned a half-finished battleship into a carrier under the sound of American bombers. Time was the enemy, and pride had silenced caution. In truth, Shinano was born from desperation. Japan's navy, once dominant across the Pacific, had been shattered by 1944. The losses of Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Marianas had crippled its carrier fleet. Pilots were gone, fuel was scarce, and the skies belonged to the United States. Yet deep within Kurei's shipyards, engineers still dreamed of an invincible weapon, something that could turn the tide. They found it in the unfinished hull of Yamato's sister ship. Instead of completing her as another battleship, Japan's high command ordered her conversion into a massive carrier, the largest ever conceived. Her purpose was to serve as a floating arsenal, capable of carrying not just aircraft but spare engines, munitions, and repair facilities for the desperate last stand of Japan's defense. But the idea came too late. America had already built dozens of Essex-class carriers, and its submarine force had perfected the art of strangling Japan's lifelines. Shinano's tragedy was not just mechanical. It was psychological, the collapse of a nation's belief that steel and sacrifice could overcome strategy and time. In a way, her end mirrored Japan's war itself. A vast empire, once unstoppable, was sinking under the weight of its own ambition. Captain Abe went down with his ship, as he had promised. Survivors recalled seeing him standing on the bridge until the final moment, refusing to abandon command. When the sea claimed him, some said he saluted, others said he simply vanished into the smoke. His last words, whispered to the officers near him, were simple: "Do not let her name be forgotten." For decades, she wasn't mentioned in official Japanese records. Only after the war did American intelligence confirm the full story: the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, a secret so extraordinary it sounded like fiction. The USS Archerfish was later credited with one of the most remarkable kills in naval history. Commander Enright, once doubted by his peers, was celebrated as the man who sank the giant that no one even knew existed. His submarine's log, "Target very large, possibly new carrier," became legendary among submariners. When divers finally located the wreck in the deep waters south of Honshu many years later, they found her lying on her side, her hull still scarred from the torpedoes that had sealed her fate. The massive flight deck was twisted, her anti-aircraft guns frozen in place. A silent cathedral of rust, still guarding its secrets in the dark. Looking back, historians called the Shinano a paradox, the ultimate expression of Japanese naval engineering and the ultimate symbol of its downfall. She embodied both brilliance and blindness, the brilliance of design, and the blindness of believing that sheer size could replace readiness, that faith could defy physics. If she had survived, she might have stood as a symbol of hope for a collapsing empire. Instead, she became a monument to haste, secrecy, and the unforgiving nature of the sea. The ocean never forgives unfinished work. And somewhere beneath the quiet waves of the Pacific, the Shinano still rests, a ghost of steel, her name whispered only by the currents that pass over her decks, and by those who remember that even the mightiest ships can be lost before they ever truly sail. Shinano, the world's largest aircraft carrier, had existed at sea for less than 17 hours.